You have a grasp on the basics, and now you're looking to get into more advanced writing techniques. Foreshadowing and flashbacks are great ways to elevate your story and add a layer of depth, but it also adds complexity and it's easy to overdo. Too much and your story becomes convoluted and ham-fisted. In this video, I'll show you how to use foreshadowing and flashbacks to enrich your story and how to avoid overusing them. So for flashbacks, one of the main questions is when? When do you use it? And the answer to that is surprisingly simple. It should function like a memory. It should pop up whenever the character would be thinking about this flashback or whenever this memory would become relevant. Now, if your character wasn't there for it, that's okay. You can still use this technique. Just treat your world like it is its own character, or your story like it's its own character. Whenever the world would sort of recall your flashback, that's when you put it in, if it's something your main character wasn't there for. And following that simple tactic will make sure that your flashbacks are always timed very well and used in the most effective way possible. If you're going to use a flashback, it should be a necessity, and it should be done to enrich the story, provide context, or give it another bit of depth. You don't want to do it gratuitously. Another use of a flashback is to hint at something to come. It can actually be a foreshadow in and of itself. The amount of flashbacks you can do is going to depend on a number of factors, namely your execution and the importance to the story. You are going to want to feel it out, of course, and see what's right for your specific use case. But above all else, you're not going to want to show the same flashback more than once unless something has happened that will make your audience see the flashback in a completely different light. If you grew up watching anime, that one might come as a bit of a surprise, but if you think about your own experience with that anime, you'll realize it's true. At first, the flashback was great. And then they show it again and again and again. And if it's been a long enough time, then it's still good. But they just keep flashback over and over and over again. That is a tendency that a lot of newer writers have and a lot of students and whatnot. The reason you're not going to want to do it is it's like, imagine if you go to a magician's show and his trick is that he's going to cut his assistant in half. The first time it's really cool. The second time it's like, okay, I already saw you do that. And then the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, eventually you're like, hold on, is there any other tricks in this show? Like, is this guy just going to keep cutting his assistant in half? Eventually you're going to wish that the magician would cut you in half so you wouldn't have to watch the magician cut his assistant in half again. That's why you don't want to show the same flashback over and over again. The reason they do it in the anime is purely logistical. They are following a manga. Usually animes are based off of manga, and they've caught up to the source material. It takes way longer to write a manga than it does to adapt it into an anime a lot of the time, because the team sizes are way bigger for the animation, and they're not coming up with the story in the first place. But that's why you'll watch an anime and it'll be a 30-minute episode and 18 minutes of it is flashback and repeated flashbacks at that. At first, they enrich the story, provide context, hint at stuff to come, but you realize in real time as you're watching it, You don't love the show because of that kind of stuff. You love it in spite of it. This is not what you want to emulate. Something to consider is that flashbacks can slow pacing and outright ruin it if they're used wrong, but they can also provide much needed breaks from high tension and act as a sort of palate cleanser that gets your audience prepared for what's to come. Each story is different, and what's right for yours depends on execution and your actual use case. I wouldn't say that there's a hard rule for frequency and duration. As long as it's not actively detracting from the story, and as long as it's building up the story, you're in the clear. Just make sure you're not ruining your pacing or making people that read it bothered by the prevalence of them. If you're spending more time in flashbacks than you need to, you reach a certain point where you have to ask yourself, is there a reason why you're doing these instead of writing what you're flashing back to? Maybe you're starting your story in the wrong spot. Maybe this should actually be a book 2 type of thing, or maybe even a book 3. And maybe you should actually start the actual story earlier and do it live, like do it in real time instead of as memories. There's also flash forwards where you sort of jump ahead in time and show something that is going to come. I can't think of a use case for this off the top of my head unless your story is about time travel or about some kind of time-based science or magic. I can't think of anything specific though, or a situation. So if you can, maybe jump down into the comments and let me know what you think. Now with foreshadowing, there's a few different ways you can use it and a few different types of use cases. But in general, what you want to do is you want it to be like you're leaving little clues for your audience. You want it to be the kind of thing where if they choose to pay extra attention and if they choose to engage with it on a deeper level, they might see the stuff coming ahead of time. Or if they don't and they rewatch it, they realize, oh, this was all hinted at ahead of time. I should have known, right? Or, oh, how cool is that? What you don't want to do is you don't want to be so glaringly obvious about it that it seems like you're beating them over the head with spoilers. Because if every single person that watches it knows what's going to happen before it happens, that's not fun. That's not cool. That's not interactive. You're giving them a little bit of a taste, right? You're giving them some intrigue, some potential mystery. You're letting them have a deeper experience than they would have otherwise. But if you're flat out giving them the answers or making things too obvious, it does the exact opposite of what you're looking for. So keep it subtle, keep it refined, keep it low key. If you made a story where everybody knows the stuff that's going to happen ahead of time, you didn't actually foreshadow. You made a predictable story. You want it to be kind of like you're leaving hints for a detective, right? You treat them like they're investigators and make it so that they can solve the case, but make it so that it's very, very possible and even very likely that they can't, is how foreshadowing tends to be best used. Just like with flashbacks, it should enrich the story and provide context to a keen eye. If something will be important later, don't be afraid to mention it, but also don't beat them over the head with it. Foreshadowing could be an action, an item, something that you mention with what seems at the time like a throwaway sentence or a throwaway line of dialogue. But later on, it reveals itself to actually have been reasonably important. Think of mystery shows or movies where something doesn't seem like a big deal at the time, but then a shift in context or perspective makes everything click. Foreshadowing can be both long term or short term, and you're best off using both of them. If you have it on different timelines and you have it happening at different instances, you're able to, leave a little bit of a breadcrumb trail or like an Easter egg hunt for your audience and keep them engaged. A good example of short-term foreshadowing is Otto Octavius in Spider-Man 2. He gets a very direct question about the artificial intelligence slash sentience that these robot arms have, and how are they not going to take over on him and tell him what to do. He says, well, I got this inhibitor chip right here, protects my higher brain function, I'll be safe. That's foreshadowing. That's also very direct. And people do know, most people know who Otto Octavius is. They know he's a bad guy. They know that something's going to go wrong, right? The people that haven't, even they're pretty aware of it, right? They're like, oh, this is probably going to break. That in and of itself is actually a good lesson. That is a sort of sacrificial lamb foreshadowing, right? If you have a little bit of obvious foreshadowing, then your more subtle stuff in comparison seems even more subtle. So if you're doing some kind of murder mystery, you can actually do a limited amount of ham-fisted in-your-face foreshadowing for the sake of veiling or cloaking your better executed foreshadowing. It's hiding in plain sight kind of thing. If we go back to our Spider-Man 2 example, it establishes rules, context, consequences, stuff like that. And then when it does break right away, because it's very short-term foreshadowing, now we understand what's going on and why we should care. That's actually a little bit of a hit, like a touch of world building right there. And a thing to keep in mind about this is that we've established all of this with just 2 to 3 lines of dialogue. You can establish things and give context very quickly. You don't need to hammer people over the head with it either. An example of longer term foreshadowing is the movie Disturbia. The main character is given an ankle monitor and told very explicitly, hey, if you leave the property, this ankle monitor will set off an alarm, and if you're not back on within 10 seconds, the police will be dispatched to your house to arrest you. That's again, blatantly obvious foreshadowing, but it gets used later in a way that is not what you would expect. So it's also more subtle foreshadowing. There are several scenes about this ankle monitor being annoying, and it's also established that the boundaries of the ankle monitor aren't actually perfect. They're not exact with his property line or anything. So there's a scene where he goes around and he purposely steps outside of the bounds to test where it is, and then he marks it with a garden tool, various different garden tools, including a gnome, and he uses a string and he ties it to those tools along the border and establishes an actual line that he can visually see. A big part of that is, he's bored at the house with nothing to do and all that. He needs some kind of activity, but now he also doesn't have to worry about where the lines are, and he knows. Because he's bored, he finds a pair of binoculars and he starts looking around the neighborhood, just sort of spying on everybody. looking in their windows and stuff too. And because of that, he ends up seeing something and becomes suspicious that his neighbor is a murderer. And he ends up spending the movie trying to investigate this neighbor, all within the confines of this dollar store string borderline that he's allowed to roam through. Now, we're going to get pretty spoilery about the movie Disturbia. I do think it's an incredible one. I watched it probably dozens of times when it first came out. If you're worried about spoilers, yeah, I'll leave a timestamp. But now that we've got that warning out of the way, in the climax of the movie, it is revealed that he is correct. It seems like he's proven to be crazy and that he's wrong. And then his mom goes over to try to apologize and save face because this neighbor seems like a pretty nice guy. So she goes over there, ends up getting attacked by the guy because he is a murderer. And then the neighbor goes over to the main character's house to try to kill him and silence him. Now, the main character has to flee the property to save himself and ends up going over to the neighbor's property to try to save the mom. And as soon as he's going through his border that he made with his string and his garden tools as anchor points, it starts beeping. Now we know, because the movie's shown us countless times, this means the police are going to come. So all they have to do is survive long enough for the police to get there, and everything should be okay. On the way to the neighbor's house, as the main character passes that garden tool anchor point, he pulls the string away and like unties it, and he frees this set of shears. So now he has a weapon to defend himself as he goes over there to save his mom. Putting the tools down as anchor points was actually foreshadowing. And in the blatant and obvious foreshadowing of, hey, you can't leave the property or else the police will go there, it turns out that there is the more subtle foreshadowing of, you can actually save yourself by getting out of your property and the police will automatically come even if you can't call. Because the shears have been there for like half the movie, it doesn't feel like a cheap cop-out that he grabs them on the way and actually has a weapon now. It feels like it was a smart move and like it was worked up to. There was no way of knowing he was going to use those shears, at least on a first watch or whatnot, unless you're really paying attention. But it gives context, it makes everything make sense, and it's cool foreshadowing that you see the second time and you're like, oh yeah, that's what he's setting up for later, without knowing it. Because the boundary for where he can go without setting off the monitor is so clearly marked visibly, and it's such a crisp border, it gives context and lets you realize how important every single inch or foot is in this chase and in this escape. And it gives a light at the end of the tunnel. This is kind of the all hope is lost moment. His mom's in the house, potentially dead, and he can't do anything about it. And now the killer's over here coming after him. But the second he gets the shears, now there's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. And now that he's on the other side of this border, yet again, bit of light at the end of the tunnel. No guarantees on either front, but we know that we can expect the police to be there, and we know that we can expect, if there's a fight, he can actually defend himself. I think with what we've got right now, that I don't want to go too much further into spoilers for the movie, even for the people that stayed the whole way through and wanted to see what I had to say about it. I've taught a bunch with the context I've given and with the spoilers I've given. I think even for the people still watching the spoiler part, I don't want to absolutely say how the end happened because it is such an incredible watch. It's an absolute masterclass in storytelling, character moments, foreshadowing, tension, and mystery. And I think that even if you watched it, it's worth giving another watch. And if you haven't watched it, I think it's one of your top must watches on your list. That's what my recommendation would be, at least. Something really important that I want to mention that you can really learn from with it. It does almost all of this from just one location. Most of the movie takes place in a single house. There are times where you're not at that house, but the vast majority of the movie is a literal regular suburban home. If that movie can make a place like that interesting, it might open up ways in your mind where it shows you how you're maybe not using your locations to the fullest that they can be. There's so many lessons it can teach, including and not including stuff that I have gone over here. Now, as always, this is it for the lesson. But as always, if you have any questions, get down in the comment section below. Go ahead and ask. I'll answer them in a comment if I can. If it's too in-depth of a question, I will make a video about it so that I can give you a proper answer.